Well, it's the 10:01. I think it's time to call the meeting to order. We have, it looks as though we have more than 30 people with us so far and more joining, so. it's a good-
Laura, sorry to interrupt. Are you going to be recording this, Laura, or do you want me to?
Paul Gedge is taking care of all of the recordings, and he'll have a YouTube
Awesome.
link for everyone after this, so
Awesome. Thank you. Sorry for an interruption.
no problem.
No problem. So we do have a quorum of the meeting. You received an agenda in advance of the meeting, and we received no requests for changes or additions, so I'll entertain a motion to approve the agenda for the meeting.
So moved.
Thank you, Leland. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you,
Commissioner
Dave.
Scott?
Any debate or discussion? All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed, nay? It's unanimous. Okay, we also sent out notes of the meeting of November 3rd and received no corrections or additions to those. So I'll entertain a motion to approve the November 3, 2021 meeting notes.
So moved.
Thank you, Dave.
Second.
Thank you, Leland. Is there any debate or discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Any abstentions, if there be any? That's unanimous. Okay, we want to launch right into our first presentation. Representative Hawks has to attend the legislative meeting shortly, so we've got him first on the agenda. He's going to cover two topics for us. First of all, he's going to give us a report on the summit that was held last week. And we'll also let anyone else chime in on that one as well. And then we're going to talk about the upcoming 2022 legislative session and what might be on the agenda for Great Salt Lake. So Tim, march away.
Well, thanks, Don, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be with you. Appreciate the opportunity to take a few minutes and talk about the summit and then a little bit of a look forward. So many of you were at the summit or heard the summit or heard about the summit, but I wanted to give just a little bit of context in terms of how it came about. It's interesting because, you know, I've been talking to the speaker for years about Great Salt Lake. He doesn't really listen to me. But when he was on his treadmill and he was listening to KUER, Radio West, talking about what could happen if the lake was lost, that really caused him to sit up and take notice. And he really wanted to tee up in advance of this session an opportunity to talk about, you know, some important steps that were to really highlight the importance of the lake, and then talk about some important steps that are being taken and need to be taken to protect the lake. And so it came together very quickly, and it was by design aimed at policymakers. Well, the public could listen in. It was aimed at sort of state and local government officials, and ultimately, nearly 300 of those type of folks signed up. About 150 were there in person, and about 150 were watching and participating online. And the program was kind of designed in terms of looking at two things. So the first half of the program was focused on the value of the lake and the need to protect it. What could be lost if the lake was lost? But we didn't want people to be too depressed. So the second half was really focused on solutions. And I will say, anecdotally, it was kind of funny because I think after the first half of the presentation, the first half of the program, somebody came up to the speaker and they said, "Oh, I'm so depressed." But knowing that, we really wanted the second half of the program to focus on whether it's legislative and policy or other solutions that are important to the lake. And so that's how it was structured. And I will say that the needs portion, the first part, was maybe a little different than the way people that are normally talking about the lake think about the lake. But even that was by conscious design. And the idea was, again, not to preach to the converted, but to preach to the unconverted, to the people that don't think about the lake or don't care about the lake, and to give them reasons to care. And because of that, it really focused on what issues are likely to touch people most immediately and most directly. And so the kind of messages that a lot of us are familiar with about the environment, those are actually the messages that resonate the least with the people that were invited to the conference. They're important, they're critical, we know they are, but they're not what resonates most. What does resonate, number one, in my experience, is air quality. So when people know that the lake could affect their air quality, they sit up and take notice where they didn't before. The second most important thing is if they think it's going to affect their skiing or their water supply, that's a big deal too. And so we had presentations on air quality, and then we had presentations on snowpack and water supply, dust effect, all that kind of stuff. And then they care about economics, because we all sort of just care about economics, and most people don't understand the economics of the lake. And so those, when we talked about the needs, air quality, snowpack and water supply, and economics were the messages that really got sort of, pounded on, because the thought was those are the messages that are really, people are going to make people sit up and pay attention where maybe they haven't done before. And the idea, again, was to kind of tee up, hey, we're going to have some legislative initiatives, and I'll talk about some of those in a minute. Let's set the groundwork for that so that policymakers kind of get a preview. They see the momentum towards these solutions. So when we go into the session, then there's already kind of this wind in the sails, if you will, to get these solutions across the finish line. I was really pleased with the conference. I'd love to get other people's thoughts in terms of what they felt, but there was a real energy there. We had tables, Friends of Great Salt Lake and our state agencies, Forestry, Fire, and GSLAC and others. We had all those tables in the front, and there felt like it was a real good energy there as people came in and engaged and learned more about the lake. And I just went online last night and I pulled up at least 15 news articles, some of which were national news articles on the summit. And what I really liked was that the messaging, if you're not careful with Great Salt Lake, if it's all gloom and doom, nobody has any hope. So you have to convince them there's a problem, but you also have to persuade them that it's solvable. And I think that the coverage coming out of the summit really did that quite well. And so just a couple of headlines. The Salt Lake Tribune: Utah lawmakers get serious about saving Great Salt Lake. KUER, Speaker Wilson's summit sounds a rallying cry to save Great Salt Lake. So focus not just on the problem, but something we're working on solutions. We're doing, we're taking important steps. And so I think if the goal was to raise the profile of the lake and to get these two messages out to people that normally don't think about it, I think it was an unqualified success. We're seeing greater awareness of the lake, more currency, and hopefully that translates into supports for the steps that need to be taken. So Don, that's all I had on the summit. I don't know if you wanted to pause for questions or comments from the group there, or just move on to the legislative step.
Let's just take a minute. Any comments or questions? Dave?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everybody involved with this. It was just unbelievable. It's well scripted, well done, well presented. Some of the council members will remember been doing this for 11 years now and putting together our annual reports and trying to get the legislature even to look at them or to get 2 minutes on the Natural Resource Committee's agenda just to have Don present. It never happened, and here we have the Speaker of the House, huge media, great presentations. I just have to pinch myself to think this is actually happening. And unfortunately, it's because of the lake's dire circumstances. But I was saying, never let a good crisis go to waste. So, congratulations, Tim and Don and everybody involved. Marcel, great job.
Thank you, Dave. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah,
Tom.
this is Tripp. I thought maybe the one missing item there is the Great Salt or the Bear River diversion that's been on the books for a while, and how that would affect that. I know that's a sensitive issue, but I thought that was one thing that should have been tabled, and maybe in the next one they will.
Okay, other comments? There's a question. Where can I get a link to the recording of the summit?
I will put it in the chat box momentarily.
Thank you. Okay, great. Thank you, Tim. Let's talk about the upcoming legislative session and what's coming at us.
Let me just add, thanks, Don, and thanks, Dave, for the kind words. And I think if there was one thing we maybe didn't do the best at that summit was recognize all the people that have been working on this for so long. It's such a big and important an issue, and I think if anything, the summit shows just how much everybody working together can really, seeds that were planted 10 years ago are bearing fruit today. And I just think it's really exciting. So thanks to everybody in all the myriad ways that you participated. As we look forward into the session, I think there's some really exciting things happening, and it goes right into that momentum that we were talking about and what Dave said about how, crises tend to have silver linings. There's opportunities wrapped into them, and this is no exception. That doesn't mean the problems are any less dire, but fortunately, we're marshaling some resources to make some real difference. One of the biggest things, and it'll probably go through the session fairly early on, is the use of federal Arpa dollars. So Utah got, I think, $1.4 billion from the federal government for infrastructure. And the good news there is that both the legislature and the governor are unified in wanting to put a lot of that into water infrastructure. And it turns out that these investments have both direct and indirect benefits for Great Salt Lake. The Speaker and the Senate President convened a group of 6 policymakers, 3 from the House and 3 from the Senate, and I'm one of the House members. Representatives Schultz and Ferry are the others. And then on the Senate side, we have Senator Sandel, McKell, and Kirk Collimore, who's in Senate leadership. They were on the other side, and then we met with the agency folks and with the Big Four and everybody else, and tried to figure out how to take this almost $500 million in water money and how to allocate it to the priorities that would really put the state in the best position moving forward. The biggest problem that group identified is the lack of secondary meters. So most of you are familiar with this problem. GSLAC's done reports on it. It's one of GSLAC's recommendations when it comes to the lake. But we still have probably north of 100,000 homes scattered around the state, but concentrated in northern Utah, particularly Davis and Weber counties, where people's outdoor water is not metered. And so forget about having a price signal. There's not even an information signal for those folks. And where they've put these meters in the past and not even changed pricing, we've seen dramatic changes in behavior. So when people know how much they're using, and I've heard great anecdotes about this, that some meters were installed in a community out in West Farmington, and immediately the neighbors were sort of standing around comparing their water use statistics. Well, because of that kind of dynamic, we typically see about a 20 to 30% reduction in water use when secondary meters are installed. And so if you can fully go back and do this problem, now there's a reason we got here. It's nobody's fault. It happened for good reasons. But to go back in and retrofit it now is quite expensive. To put one of these meters into a new home is $300 or $400. To retrofit an existing home is more on the order of about $2,000 per hookup. And so the total cost, the state estimates the total cost to get rid of secondary meters, to put new meters on secondary systems, is on the order of $400 million. But the idea is that if the state comes up with 250 and we partner that with the providers themselves having to invest some money and the users themselves having to invest some money, we can take care of this legacy problem, the significant legacy problem with this generational investment. It's hoped that if we do that, it can generate up to 80,000 acre feet of additional water. That's the equivalent of building a new reservoir. Now, from the lake standpoint, you say, well, why would we care about generating that new supply? Well, the more we hold in the reservoirs, then in the wet years, the more spills down to Great Salt Lake. It helps the entire system if we can optimize use and not waste it, quite frankly, spraying it onto sidewalks and driveways and things like that. So 250 for secondary metering, 75 million from agricultural water optimization. You can save a lot of water in the agricultural space, but a lot of the users don't have the capital to make the investments in those high-tech solutions that can yield significant water savings. And so there's a fund, and it's a matching fund really with 75 million in ARPA dollars that is designed to facilitate those types of uses. And we're hoping to work priorities in so that if you're in the watershed of the Great Salt Lake, you get a priority, sort of a extra weight when they're evaluating your proposal, because you can show sort of a systemic benefit in a place where scarcity is really a problem. So 75 million for agricultural water optimization. And then this is the exciting bit, 50 million for the Great Salt Lake. That includes 5 million that's already been appropriated for the adaptive management berm in the Causeway to modify that so we can regulate the flow of salt north to south a little bit and optimize that for the ecosystem and other uses, and also some dredging on the South Marina because the state's having a difficulty getting their boats in and out. So 5 million of ARPA funds have already been allocated for that. We plan to get an additional $45 million for, lake habitat and water supply and all these other pressing needs. This is an unprecedented investment. And let me just say, this is where, for example, the speaker picking up the laboring oar makes such a difference. When we knew there was going to be ARPA funds, a couple of the legislators concerned about the lake, particularly me and Representative Ferry, thought, well, let's see if we could put in for some federal ARPA dollars and maybe get some money for the lake. We were hoping, pie in the sky, the home run was to get $5 or $10 million for the lake. Well, the speaker gets involved, and suddenly we're talking about $50 million for the lake, which is huge. We know that that's not enough to solve it, and the legislature knows that's not enough to solve the problems. But it is an important initial investment in this critical resource, and it's really a great thing to see. Funding aside, let me just mention at least 3 bills that I think might be of interest to this group. Representative Joel Ferry has a bill called In-Stream Flow Amendments. And this is a subject near and dear to my heart because in 2006, I passed the first version of this. It was called In-Stream Flow to Protect Trout Habitat. And it was, I liken it to a child's bike, but instead of having 2 training wheels on the back, it had like 25 training wheels. Like I basically accepted any restriction on that authority as long as we could still show some proof of concept to show that we could basically lease water for environmental purposes and the sky would not fall. That was the idea. And Representative Ferry has a bill that is the grown-up version of that takes almost all of those training wheels off and just comes up with a much more usable system. It explicitly recognizes that that water in, for example, Great Salt Lake is a beneficial use. And that doesn't take a block of water and dedicate it to Great Salt Lake, but what it does is create a mechanism where the lake can at least play on an equal playing field with other uses for water. And it facilitates transactions like the one that Rio Tinto and Audubon and others and TNC and others entered into. It helps facilitate those kinds of transactions because it provides greater legal certainty in support of those kind of transactions. So I think that's an exciting bill, one to watch. It's done very well through the fall in terms of getting water task force and committee endorsements and everything else. So expect to see that move through. But it's an important step forward. I have a bill that deals with the Sovereign Lands Management Account, and it really is aimed at more long-term funding for the lake. Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, and Jamie's on, and they do just a tremendous job. And currently, money from the mineral industries goes into the Sovereign Lands Management, goes into a restricted account, right? And the language about how that money can and should be spent is pretty loose. So what's happened in the past is that fund builds up, then the legislature can't resist the urge to come in and just take out the funds and spend them on other things. And these are important things, but they've used them, for example, to keep the national parks open when the federal government shut them down. And we know that Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, their mission is much broader than just the sovereign lands. They're dealing with forestry issues as well, right, and fire issues as well. So one of the ideas is really to take that account and tighten it up and say, really, if money out of that restricted account ought to go to benefit the state sovereign lands. So that's kind of idea number one. And that creates some cost shifts and some things we need to do. But ultimately, it should free up more of those funds to really focus on Great Salt Lake. And the second piece of it is that it earmarks any new mineral royalties. So if we see royalties coming off of lithium, for example, and royalties are paid, that goes into an additional restricted account that deals with lake water supply. So the idea is that, again, it's not going to perfectly solve any of this stuff, but at least it takes funds that are already being generated by this critical resource and it reinvests them in that resource so that the resource doesn't have to go out and compete for these scarce general funds in the way it's had to in the past. So I think, again, that's focused on trying to stabilize the long-term funding for the lake a little bit. Tom's on there, and Tom, I haven't even talked to you directly about this. I've talked to some of the lobbyists and different folks about it, but welcome thoughts and suggestions there. But my hope is that by taking those funds that are now being used for things sometimes that are tangentially related to lake or not at all, that it's better to just reinvest it in the goose that laid the golden egg. You know, let's keep the goose alive.
Yeah, let me congratulate the legislature, Tim. 20 years ago, it went to the Oakley Rodeo Queen. So they have developed some discipline, and we're doing a lot better than we used to.
Well, thanks, Tom. We're trying
Not
to
that I have anything against the Oakley Rodeo.
No, I know. Well, we're trying to iron out some of the weirdness. But what we've had in the past is the Oakley Rodeo's got it. And then now Great Salt Lake, when I've gone for research dollars, you know, we've had to go compete for general funds, which is really hard to do. So anyway, thank you to the mineral industry. And I hope one of the big things that people have come to realize is just how important that industry is to our state and its future.
And the
The
country.
last one. Sorry, Tom, I talked over you saying something.
Yeah, and the country, you know. We do unique things here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Potassium sulfate, magnesium, lithium. This is unique in the whole country.
Right. Well, thanks for all the good work you're doing on that front, and we hope we can highlight it. I still love, and I still use it from Tom, you know, you touch a pop can, you touch the Great Salt Lake, and it touches you. Most people don't realize, and I think that's such a critical way to show people how the lake's connected to us. The last bill I'll mention, and then I'm done. There's lots of little bills that are out there, one sort or another, but Representative Robert Spenlove has one on useless turf. Effectively, what he says is that if you're a city or you're an HOA or similar, you cannot enforce an ordinance that would require somebody to put in turf. And then as far as state property goes, it's very aggressive in terms of saying that if the state is building a new facility, no more than 20% can be turf, and puts them actually on an aggressive water conservation schedule moving into the future. Starts them out with they got to show 5%, and then they got to show 25%. So Robert Spenlove isn't somebody that normally works in this space, but I think he sensed the problem. And so he's tried to go after what seemed like an obvious problem to him. And I say it's not the grass that we use, it's the grass that we don't use that's the problem. And his bill is aimed at that. So others may be aware of others, but those are, Don, those are the ones that I kind of see. It's both the funding side and then the on the bill side, those are some bills of note.
Thank you, Tim. Any questions or comments or? Go ahead.
I have one comment.
Leland?
Yeah, you know, in Arizona, wastewater, when it's discharged, is considered new water. Whereas in Utah, we have the possessiveness of the people who had it originally wanting to continue to have availability of it. But if we were to change it back to like Arizona, where it's considered new water, and then dedicate that water to the Great Salt Lake before all these reuse projects that are on this that are moving towards starting gates get done, you'd have a significant amount of water that could be dedicated to the Great Salt Lake. But if we wait too much longer, those reuse projects are going to take that water and start using it in the middle of the spring, summer, and fall. Just a thought.
Thank you, Leland. Dave, did you have your hand up?
Tom Ward was first.
Go ahead, Tom.
Oh, you're kind, Dave. Thank you. Tim, first of all, I think all of us know you've been working on this for a long time and your fingerprints on a lot of this. So huge accolades to you and the work you've done. I know you have lots of partners, but you're at the spear there. On the tail of kind of what Leland was mentioning, I'm curious also on the ag efficiency. Do you one, do we have existing legislation that you've done some things over the last few years that allows water to flow to the lake? But when we do an efficiency project, does a gallon saved, is it, whatever we save on ag efficiency or this 80,000 acre feet on the secondary metering, is there a direct link to water being in the lake, or is that water just going to get ushered over the next development or the next expansion of agricultural?
Yeah, it's a great question, Tom. And some of this is rough accounting. So we're not going to be able to point to this acre foot saved is this acre in the lake. In the spirit of broader optimization, you're just going to do it, right? And hope that it benefits some. Now, I will say this, when we talk about doing some of these projects, particularly in a banking context, where we're going to fund an efficiency in exchange for water being freed up and being placed in a bank, I think that's where we really need to see some accounting. Dave and Marcel are in a space where if you're going to go out and you're going to pitch a private donor on doing something for the lake, they are not going to be satisfied with sort of rough accounting. We're going to do this in the spirit of helping water supply in the state of Utah. They're going to want to see that their investment has a tangible, measurable benefit for the lake. And I think that's where we're making some headway on that. We have a long ways to go in terms of doing it. I'd like to prioritize water that goes in from, say, ag optimization, and we can actually account for that and show it. And if you can show that benefit, then you're going to get a kicker, right? Then you're going to get an additional sort of weight on that application. So it's a critical thing to keep in mind. I can tell you right now, we don't have a perfect handle on it, but we are working on it. And I think some of this ARPA funding is going to have a flavor of that. And Leland, to your point, it's a great one. We got to figure that out, because I think right now, even a city in-stream flow or environmental uses is not considered a viable reuse option at this point. If I'm not mistaken, it's not. Well, I think it's just silent, but there's listed things that are okay for reuse, and that's not one of them. So we've got some work to do on that front.
Dave and then Lynn.
I just wanted to comment, Tim, all three of these pieces of legislation are so important, and they all also are unprecedented. But I did want to, particularly on the designation of new leases for the lake and the permanent fund, thank Tom and everybody in the industry. Tom, I always carry my piece of magnesium here. We use this on our trip, and I think this represents this remarkable alliance between conservation and industry that's manifested in the lake. And the more that we can emphasize that at the legislature, maybe emphasize industry more than ag, that would help us. So kudos on all three of these measures. Let's hope they pass.
Dave, Lynn?
Yeah, Tim, do you know anything about Representative Ballard's bill to kind of shore up water leaking and efficiency of existing infrastructure?
Yeah, Representative Ballard has one that's really on water loss accounting. And it's a little bit tricky from sort of a lake standpoint, because the lake might benefit from leaks, just to be honest. I mean, it's Representative Ballard's bill, really is a little bit of a hardening of the demand, if you might say it. But it does make sense for these cities, because we don't know where the water goes, and they are probably diverting more than they need to really figure out, do audits and identify whether there are leaks in their systems, and if there are leaks in their systems, and figure out how to address those leaks. And that's all in a spirit of what I would call optimization, which is just making sure that we understand where the water is and why it's there. And her bill advances that. I think Senator Iwamoto also has one on indoor fixtures. But again, for the reasons that Leland sort of said, for a lake cause, that may not be the best, because we rely, the lake relies on a lot of that treated sewage effluent today. And so, some of those things are a little bit of it's a little bit tricky to figure out how the lake is better or worse, depending on the scenario.
Thank you. I don't see any others. Tim, I know you've got a meeting to get to. Appreciate your taking the time this morning and your work on all these issues.
My pleasure. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for all you do.
Tim?
Okay, next on our agenda, we're required as a state board to have some ethics training every year. And so we've invited Emma Whitaker, Assistant Attorney General, to conduct that today. Emma, I saw you join earlier. You're still with us?
Yep, I'm still here, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a few slides, if that's all right.
Great, thank you.
All right, can everybody see those?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. So thanks, Don. Like Don said, my name is Emma Whitaker. I'm an Assistant Attorney General and Counsel for the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. Today, I'm just going to briefly talk about State Board and Commission ethics, procedure, and conduct. So I'm going to cover several points today, all of which I'm sure everyone's familiar with. The first is the requirements of the Open and Public Meetings Act. The second, conflicts of interest in the Public Employee Ethics Act. GRAMA, the Government Records Access and Management Act. And finally, I'll briefly touch on participation with the Utah legislature as council members. So first, the Open and Public Meetings Act. Generally, this act requires that there be notice and an open deliberative process before a public body votes on matters under its jurisdiction, and all votes must be taken in public. So this act applies to all public bodies. That term is defined in statute, and the council certainly fits within that definition. And a meeting is also defined as a meeting in which a quorum of the body convenes to discuss or act upon a subject over which the body has jurisdiction. So there's three key points within this act that you all should be aware of. The first is notice. So notice should be given at least 24 hours in advance of a meeting and posted at the public body's office and on the public notice website and in a newspaper. The meeting agenda must also be posted. The second point is in reference to electronic meetings. Obviously, in these days of COVID, they can be conducted if proper notice is given, and each member has an opportunity to participate. The public body must also adopt their own policy governing electronic meetings, which I'm sure the council has done after 2 years of living through COVID. The public body must also provide means to attend in person unless the chair determines not to because of a health or safety risk. And then the third point deals with closed meetings and when and if you can conduct those. Those can be conducted to discuss certain topics which are mentioned in the statute, and those include character, professional competence, physical or mental health of an individual, discussions about strategy, strategy sessions about acquiring property, real property. And further, a public body must have a quorum present to vote whether it's appropriate to have a closed meeting. And the meeting minutes have to reflect those votes and the reasons for closing the meeting. So my second point is the Ethics Act and conflicts of interest. So there's what's called the Public Officers and Employees Ethics Act, and that sets forth standards of conduct for officers and employees of the state of Utah, and it also governs board and council members. So there's three main points from owner of a substantial interest in any business entity subject to regulation of the agency is required to disclose that position and the precise nature and value of the interest. And so doing, the individual must present a written statement, and that has to be filed with the agency head and with the Attorney General's office. And the Act just generally prohibits certain actions, which are listed on the screen. I won't read through those, but generally any action or furtherance of a personal or financial interest via your position as a council member is prohibited under the Act. So we'll move now to conflicts of interest. So a conflict of interest is defined here on the screen, but for example, it can include relationships or interests with people, businesses, nonprofits, professional, charitable, religious educational, environmental organizations with which you're connected as a member, employee, officer, etc., or in which you have a continued financial interest or to which you are indebted financially. And there are no specific mandates on how conflicts of interest should be resolved statutorily. However, there are penalties for violating this Ethics Act, including removal from office and punishment via third-degree felony or misdemeanor, depending on the value of compensation or the value of the conflict. So I'll turn to GRAMA. GRAMA is everyone's favorite. So this is the Government Records Access and Management Act. And essentially this act requires government agencies to retain government records in accordance with a set retention schedule and to provide copies of or permit access to public records in its possession. So as council members, to most easily fulfill the requirements of GRAMA, you should always provide council staff with a copy of any record you create as part of your official service, and then any record you receive from outside the agency in the course of your official service. So this can include things like letters, handouts, anything given to you by constituents, advocates, or others that deal with council business or official duties. This does not include copies of items passed out in council meetings, since staff already has these. Public records can also include communications via text and email about public business. That's something to be mindful of, and that's regardless of whether you use a public or private device. And these aren't necessarily records you need to give to council staff, but just knowing that those are public records is something to be mindful of. So in the event that any council members ever receive a GRAMA request from the public or anyone else, submit it to council staff immediately. GRAMA does impose a short deadline on responding. So there are some exceptions. A few I already mentioned. So records from accounts or records a council member receives from staff will already have those and will be responsible for complying with GRAMA. And then also records a council member receives from sources outside of the agency, copies of which are already given to staff. Again, they're responsible for complying with GRAMA. And then council members' notes or memoranda made in connection with an adjudicative hearing, those are not considered records under GRAMA. A board member's personal notes and daily calendars prepared for personal use, those are also not considered records. And then junk mail or commercial publications are not records as well. So in summary, as long as you routinely provide staff with copies of records you create or receive, it's unlikely you'll personally have GRAMA-able records that may not fit into one of these exceptions, other than possibly communications. And then finally, in a previous meeting, I think someone had asked about how the council may participate with the legislature during the session. And as far as I can find, there's not necessarily statutory authority to answer this question, but I think many of the public employee ethics just discussed apply similarly to any interaction with the legislature. So in engaging with the legislature as a state employee, always be mindful of your own personal interests in light of your duties as a member of the council and advocate appropriately. Also, I think transparency is very important with both the council about interactions with legislators and with the legislature in communicating your membership with the council. And further, as executive branch employees, I think it's always important to maintain some level of neutrality when conveying, facts and science, no matter who the audience is. So also note that part of the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council's mandate under its governing statute is to assist the Department of Natural Resources, DEQ, and their applicable boards in accomplishing their responsibilities for Great Salt Lake. So I think this could include, some level of engagement with the legislature, and the council is also required to report annually to the Natural Resources Appropriations Subcommittee on council's activities. So that also implies some level of involvement with the legislature. So thanks everyone for your time and attention. I know this is not the most exciting subject matter. My name's Emma Whitaker, and my contact information is here. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me with questions or concerns about anything I discussed today during your tenure. I'm certainly by no means an expert in any of these topics, but I'll do my best to find an answer for you and help in any way that I can.
Thank you, Emma, very much. Anyone have any questions of Emma? All right, appreciate that very much. Let's go to the next agenda item. As you know, in 2019, the Great Salt Lake Salinity Advisory Committee was established to provide recommendations for long-term management of the salinity of Great Salt Lake. Those recommendations to go to Forestry, Fire and State Lands and the Utah Division of Water Quality. Regarding modifications to the Causeway, the Berm, the channel, and other long-term management issues. Jeff Bleyker has been the facilitator of that group, and we've invited him to give us an update on their activities. Jeff, fire away.
Great, thanks, Don. First of all, I think be remiss if I did not acknowledge all of the people who are involved. I know Division of Forestry, Fire and State Lands, and Division of Water Quality were critical in helping stand this committee up and then supporting the committee in its work. And all of these folks that are on the committee, whether they're members or alternates, they've been very much engaged over the last couple of years. And it's not just attending meetings, but they've been actually doing a lot of the work in the field, analyzing the databases, running different scenarios, et cetera. Really have invested a lot into the work of the Salinity Advisory Committee. So want to acknowledge them because much what I'm presenting, well, everything I'm presenting here really represents their work and their discussion. As Don mentioned, one of the goals of the primary goal of the Salinity Advisory Committee is really to provide recommendations to the state of Utah for long-term management of its city. And what I wanted to talk about here just briefly today was just two of those areas that they were charged to provide recommendations for. One is recommendations on appropriate salinity ranges that maximize the benefits of Great Salt Lake and its beneficial uses. And secondly, long-term management of water and salt transfer through the Union Pacific Causeway. Just really, and I think this is really kind of the headline here. In December, the advisory committee submitted a letter with a memorandum with recommendations pertaining to the rising salinity in the South Arm, and submitted that to the directors of the Division of Forestry, Fire and State Lands, and Division of Water Quality. And I just wanted to kind of give you some background here, but also what the primary recommendations were. That's on the left that you see there in italics really is the motion that the committee unanimously approved and wanted to issue to the Utah. The first point really is the committee has observed declining lake levels, rising salinity concentrations, and an increasing trajectory of salt mass in the south arm of Great Salt Lake. I don't think the declining lake levels is new information for any of you. You can see here the USGS gauging record, and that red line should be lower than that. But my point here is the lake is still below low record lake level for Great Salt Lake. The second point is just rising salinity concentration. State of Utah, USGS, researchers, industry have been doing a great job over the years, really the decades of monitoring changes in salinity in the lake. And this is a plot that USGS provided to the committee back in November. And really, you can see here on the right-hand side, this spans from 2010 through November of 21. But what you see here is that the gray line, as the lake has been declining, the salinities have been increasing. And I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. The salt mass in the lake stays in the lake. And as the lake level goes down, one would expect the salinity to increase. But when we start looking at some of the specifics of where we are, this is, just I guess diving in a little bit deeper. The Salinity Advisory Committee came up with a recommended range of salinities of from 120 to 160 as being most beneficial to the beneficial uses of the lake. And as you can see here from this plot, 160 being the upper that range. In the upper brine layer, this is the top part of the water column, the salinity has been exceeding 1 threshold. These upper numbers here represent the salinity of the deep brine layer, so at the bottom of the lake. And the concern is not only are the salinity levels in the upper brine layer exceeding this range, but if and when the lake does mix, where we see the salinity of the deep brine layer and the upper brine layer mix and integrate, that salinity in the upper brine layer or of the lake would be even higher than we're seeing right now in the shallow waters. And so where did that range come from? Just briefly, this is some of the work that the committee worked on for probably a year, and really looking at all of the different uses of the lake, the different components of the ecology. And what you see here with this matrix is really the reduced version of it. And the matrices and the memos are available on Forestry, Fire and State Lands Great Salt Lake website. But what we see here is this range of 120 to 160. I think it's important to note that the South Arm has been below that, and it has been above that in the past. But that this range here was identified as most protective of the ecology, as well as being able to support mineral extraction uses and brine shrimp industry in the South Arm. Back to the committee's motion, we've observed the declining lake levels. We've observed the rising salinity concentrations. This last point was what really kind of tipped the balance here. So we've also been observing an increasing trajectory of salt mass in the South Arm. Phil Brown, Thomas Bosteels with the Brine Shrimp Cooperative first brought this to the committee's attention back in September, and to illustrate some trends that they've been observing over the years in the South Arm, and it was noteworthy enough that other members of the committee here, principally the USGS, looked at their own independent database to see if they were observing those same trends. They are. You can see side by side, we see very similar trends where the overall salt load or salt mass in the South Arm has been slowly increasing over the last few years. Looking at it another way, this is from Phil Brown, the Brine Shrimp Cooperative. The black dots represent salinity in the South Arm, the lake levels on the bottom here, prior to the new bridge opening. And you can see, as expected, the salinities do increase as the lake levels go down. But what we saw when the bridge was opened is that the orange dots, we have a new trend as salt was exported to the North Arm when that bridge was opened, or when it was opened. But what we've seen here in the last couple of years, as the lake has been dropping further, is that the salinity trend is really getting back online here with what we observed before, and appears to continue to be increasing. This chart is from USGS, and this is really looking at the salt mass again. We see here in the South Arm, we see that the salt mass really dropped in the South Arm when the breach was opened, but now the salt mass is increasing. So there's a lot of questions as to why is this happening, and let's try to get our arms around the science of this. And really what it came down to is that the conclusion was that this is of concern to the Salinity Advisory Committee. So this is the second statement in the motion, is that the committee is concerned that these trends will have a detrimental effect on the foundation of Great Salt Lake's food web. principally the brine shrimp and the microbialites in the lake, and subsequently will impact ecological, recreational, industrial uses of the lake. So again, this comes back to their analysis and looking at what the the salinity ranges that all of these different parts of the food web of the different uses of the lake really need to be able to succeed in the lake. And then lastly, the committee advises the need for action, that the need for action is urgent, and recommends that the state of Utah immediately begin planning, permitting, and construction of temporary modifications to the flow control berm at the new Union Pacific Causeway Bridge. You might recall when they built that bridge, they had the foresight to put a berm on the north side of the bridge that really was intended to replicate the historical flow of salt and water through the causeway. And largely, it has been successful. But what we're seeing now with these new unprecedented low lake levels is we're seeing quite a bit of salt being exported from the north arm into the south arm. And so the objective here with making some modifications to this berm is to slow down or stop that upward trajectory of salinity in the south arm while these low lake levels are low. Of course, we recognize that the lake conditions will change if the lake levels do increase again. So these modifications should be temporary. They should be adaptively managed and coupled with the intensive monitoring while the committee seeks a long-term salinity management solution. The committee has developed a research framework, a plan for how they can develop a long-term management plan to really look at, what sorts of tools do we have or what kinds of modifications we make to be able to manage salinity at all different lake levels. But right now, that research is still underway, and we don't have the models that we need to be able to really look at that full spectrum. But when we look at the data that we do have, the committee is concerned about increased trajectory in the south arm and want to try to do something while we can here. And so I think in terms of next steps, the state of Utah has already started to work on this. Forestry, Fire and State Lands has been working with Division of Water Quality, the Corps of Engineers, and Union Pacific to really try to get their arms around all of the different ownership considerations here, the regulatory requirements. We can't just go in and haphazardly make a change. There's a lot of different people involved here. And so they've really started that collaborative process. I think another important piece to this puzzle has been a three-dimensional hydraulic flow model that Dr. Samdata at USU has been working on as part of a Hot Topics grant, and really to try to understand how what's driving the flow through that bridge opening. And so he's got a model that he's developed, and right now Forestry, Fire and State Lands and others on the committee are working with him to look at how we can update that model and look at some new berm configurations. Principally, can we raise that berm a couple of feet, and will that help? And also working with USGS to really try to refine our flow measurement methods and make sure we can make as informed of a decision as we can. With others, Forestry, Fire and State Lands is working with Division of Water Resources on the design and the construction elements of this. And then these other agencies, USGS, UGS, and the Brine Shrimp Cooperative are continuing to monitor flow through the bridge and changing lake conditions. So we have a meeting coming up next week on the 25th to discuss this further. But what we hope to do is try to move the science forward, try to look at, well, what kinds of modifications can we make that are temporary, that we can use to try to minimize some of these potentially detrimental effects to the beneficial uses while the lake is this low. So sorry to run through that, a lot of science behind all this, but if you have any questions, happy to try to answer them.
Thank you, Jeff, very much. Any questions or comments? Dave? You're muted, Dave.
I think you're on mute.
Okay, I was going to say, thanks, Jeff. Great presentation. And many of us remember the early debates on reaching the Causeway and various engineering feats. And I remember mentioning then, I'll mention again now, is there any consideration to a structure that would enable kind of like a headgate mechanism on a grand scale that could be pulled up or pushed down? It'd be very expensive, but there is now some ARPA funding, and just think of the Netherlands, what they do in Holland and other places like that, where they have massive, stainless steel, basically modified headgates that come up and down and control water, rather than just the berms that you basically are throwing a rock or two and with a backhoe.
David, let me give you a little bit of perspective from a solar industry basis. When you're dealing with saturated brine, means laying down salt, it's very difficult. One of the tried and true method in solar ponding is you use wooden timbers and then you use dynamite to open them because they just will never move again once they get salted up.
Okay, that's one
right. And I think the short answer, Dave, is that yes, that is kind of I would say that's the dream. That's really what we want to work toward, is to have a more permanent structure that does give us flexibility to make changes in flow, whether it's releasing more flow from the south going north, or controlling flow through either way. The key right now is, and I think that's really why we're moving forward with this hydraulic flow model, is to try to look at, try to better understand the physics that's going on here. It's quite complicated, but then so that we can design something that is more effective and sustainable long term.
Thanks.
Thank you. Other questions, comments?
Well, Don, if I could just add to Jeff's comment, we have started to get some estimates, I guess you would say. Representative Hawks has reached out to some people to get some estimates, and we have ranges. I like to say like the Kia version of modification all the way up to a Cadillac. And so it's like, ranging from $2 million to $80 million. So there's a range of money to be spent on these types of modifications. So depending on what we want to do and when we want to do it, that's gonna, and how much money we have to do it are all gonna play a role.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Other questions of Jeff or comments? Jeff, thank you. Excellent report, and we appreciate your work with the committee. Let's jump to the next agenda item. We have a request from the Division of Water Resources to support a request they have of the Bureau of Reclamation, and I'll let Laura explain that.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I have a really brief explanation or update, but like Don said, the Division of Water Resources is interested in doing a basin study. These are studies that the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation engages in regularly, and we're looking at doing a Great Salt Lake Basin study. So this is a large-scale study, I think bigger than what they're typically into, but Water Resources is up for the task to go ahead and get this project underway. The project would look at, have four main elements, and I'm just going to read them to you really quick. Number one, projections of how water supply and demand, including risks of climate change. Number two, an analysis of how existing water and power infrastructure and operations will perform in response to changing water realities. And number three, the development of strategies to improve operations and infrastructure to supply adequate water in the future. And number four, trade-off analysis of the strategies identified. And so Water Resources has reached out to the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, in addition to several of other entities, including large water districts in the basin, just to act as stakeholders and participate in this multi-year process. So I believe it's like a 5-year process. But what that would mean for the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council is not to contribute any fund. It doesn't, or any funding. It doesn't obligate us to pay for anything. It just requests that we participate in meetings, review documents, and I'm happy to serve as that person to be involved, and I can update the council regularly. If there are concerns or objections, or if, please let me know. Also, if there are council members that may be interested in joining me, they would be welcome to. But I'm happy to hear any concerns. If there are none, then I would be happy to put together a letter of support for the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation to support the Basin Study project.
Any questions or comments of Laura? Is there anyone?
Sorry, just one thing. Jake Sarago is here, and he's the one who's leading us at Water Resources, and Candace is here if they have anything to add.
I make the motion, we approve support for the project.
Thank you, Leland. Is there a second? Thank you, Dave. Any debate or discussion? Any further questions? All in favor say aye. Any opposed, nay? Any abstentions? It's unanimous. And no, there's no funding required from the council.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Let's have a brief update on the projects that the council currently has underway. The first one I'll comment on is the Great Salt Lake Hydro Mapper, also known as the dashboard. We're expecting that project to be completed this spring, and it'll provide a central updated source of information on the lake, including lake levels, salinity levels, water basin information, stream flows, reservoir storage levels, etc. So that's progressing well and nearing completion. There was some comment earlier about breach monitoring. We stepped in to pay the continuing monitoring of the new breach through the end of this fiscal year. It's anticipated at that point in time that it could roll into the Berm modification and management takeover by Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. We've heard a little bit about the breach modeling. The Great Salt Lake technical team did issue a hot topics grant to SOM to do that initial model. It needed to be updated, and we stepped in and are funding that update so it can be used in the project that Jeff Bleyker told us about. We're anticipating a couple of white papers on snow and dust surveys that we can use to develop executive summaries on those studies. We've got a project undergoing at the request of the Salinity Advisory Committee to update the method of estimating salinity of the Great Salt Lake. They call it the equation of state update, and we expect that to be completed in the next few months. There's a large study that involves some of our funding, but funding from several state agencies as well, to understand the nutrient sources and cycling in the lake. As you know, adequate nutrients are critical to the health of the brine shrimp and the birds that rely upon them. So those are the studies that the Advisory Council has underway, and some of them are nearing completion. The next thing I wanted to talk about is future studies. We have a $125,000 annual appropriation, which comes from a diversion of brine shrimp royalties into the management fund. And we have, that's the funding that we've used to sponsor the 25 studies. Actually, I guess we've only had that for a few years for the studies for the last few years. What we need to do is allocate that appropriation for studies for fiscal year 2023. I don't intend to do that allocation today. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the kinds of studies we've done in the past, and then ask you over the next 30 days to submit any suggestions or recommendations for projects to Laura. We'll compile those and bring them back to our March meeting to try to begin the process of allocating those appropriations. The kinds of studies we've done in the past include the basic foundational studies we did on economic benefits of Great Salt Lake and the definition of the health and assessment of the health of the lake. We've done a handful of studies relating to lake level, including consequences of drying lake systems around the world, assessment of potential costs of a drying Great Salt Lake, our water strategies report, where we compiled 72 strategies to address lake level, the legal and feasibility study that we conducted on 12 priority strategies from that report, and we provided a facilitator that resulted in the HCR 10 recommendations, also to secure adequate water flows to the lake. We funded some conservation-related studies, including our conservation impact study and the second expanded impact study. We've also funded the start of the water and land use planning integration, which is now ongoing with larger funding from the state. We've been involved in Salinity. We recommended the creation of the Salinity Advisory Council and are funding the GSL Equation of State study. We've created some tools to help in managing the Great Salt Lake, including the Great Salt Lake Integrated Water Resources Model. We've used that to assess future conditions of the lake, and we've also provided some funding to update that model. We've provided some funding for public education, press releases, interviews, talking points, media training, development of a couple of videos. I mentioned previously the dashboard, which is a public education tool. And then we funded some studies for some unique specific issues related to the lake, including Phragmites control, the nutrient mass of the lake, water reuse, understanding lake effect, precipitation. So those are the types of studies we've done in the past. I think a lot of them build upon each other to address key issues and to try to influence policy decisions and actions, since we don't have the authority to make those policies ourselves. So I'm happy to have some discussion today if anyone has some comments or questions or suggestions. What I really intend here is that we'll take 30 days, and if you could by February 12th forward any suggestions or recommendations for studies that we could undertake, and be creative, and let's have lots of options to look at, and then we'll go through those at our March meeting and try to have some appropriation decisions in place as we approach the beginning of the next fiscal year. Any questions? Comments? Okay, great. So if you forward those to Laura, Dave?
I just had a question on the 125. I should know this, Don, and thank you for making this possible through the Rhinestone Ministry. Is it a percentage of royalties, or is it a set amount, 125 each year?
It's a set amount.
Set amount.
125, right. And that quantity does vary. The rest of the money, the money from the royalty used to always go into the Endangered Species Mitigation Fund, and that amount was anticipated to be 500,000 or 600,000, but over time, it's annually. It's many times it's gone over $1 million, and so there was a surplus accumulating there, and so that was really we robbed that surplus to bring some funding to the advisory council, because otherwise we're relying upon the generosity of the Nature Conservancy and other people who would step forward and provide funds, and that was very useful and helpful. But really not fair for us to come knocking on the same doors year after year for money. So this has facilitated a lot of good studies that have helped advance, I think, the debate, inform the debate about the Great Salt Lake.
Yeah, this is fantastic. I mean, the list you just read is really impressive.
I just want to note too, when you guys are thinking about projects, that this funding will be available on July 1st, and it has to be spent by the end of June of the next fiscal year. So this money doesn't hang around. If it doesn't get spent, it goes back, and it has to be. We can't carry it over for the following years.
Thank you, Laura. And Dave, any other questions or comments? Let's go to the next agenda item. We always allow some time for public comment. I want to reserve some of that time for Steve Erickson. Steve, are you with us?
Yes.
Okay, before you go, let me ask, is there anyone else who would like to some time for public comment, so I know how to allocate the time? Okay, Steve, fire away.
Yeah, thank you, Don. I wanted to let everyone know that the draft environmental impact statement for the Pine Valley water supply project was released on January 7th. It's now the clock is ticking. A 45-day comment period is in place. I have forwarded to Laura and Don a letter I would like the advisory council to consider signing on to or producing one of its own, requesting an additional 45 days or a total of 90 days for public review and comment on that draft environmental impact statement. It's about 250 pages long. It's technical and scientific in nature in many respects. There are hydrological issues that need to be analyzed by people qualified to do so. There is no real skin off anyone's back with an additional 45 days for review that won't have any significant delay or in the project or any particular prejudice or inconvenience to the proponent of the project. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We're about to head into the Utah legislature. I'm not sure which is worse, but there's every reason why we need to have additional time to review this document. Why it's of interest to Great Salt Lake advocates? Well, this is part of the same groundwater flow system that we objected to when Las Vegas wanted to pump and pipe water out of that general region in the West Desert and in eastern Nevada. The impacts from this project, according to the USGS and latest analysis, means that there will be impacts to the groundwater and the seeps and springs throughout that region, including in Snake Valley and parts of eastern Nevada. Drawdowns will have an impact potentially upon Great Salt Lake, Bonneville Salt Flats, probably in the springs and seeps in the Tula Valley, and also Fish Springs National Wildlife Refuge. So this has large-scale implications for decades to come, if not being irretrievable and irreversible, which is what the BLM referred to the impacts from the Las Vegas project. Therefore, we believe that this is important to protect Great Salt Lake's groundwater beneath the surface waters of the lake. And with that, I would just ask you all to consider requesting an extension of the comment deadline so that we might be able to discuss this in more detail at the meeting in March.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Any questions or comments?
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment if I can. I was on the UGS board when the study was commissioned by the state. And being a Great Salt Lake guy, I found it extremely interesting that it was well-documented proof that this project will take water and move it from the Great Salt Lake Basin and put it in the Colorado system. This is a project where Iron County would like to reach up, Steve, most of 80 miles to get water that's not currently used in an industrial residential way, but it's the lifeblood of ranching and wildlife. Plus, it'll take off flow that eventually would make it to the Great Salt Lake. It may be a 10 or 20-year cycle to get it there, so you won't know for a while. So it's an interesting topic, and I think it deserves more interest in examination.
Thank you, Tom. Any other comments or questions? So the step we're talking about today is simply to request an extension in the comment deadline so that the difficult technical issues can be better evaluated. And then we would invite Steve back at our March meeting to provide a more detailed report about the potential impacts on the Great Salt Lake. So let's address the first issue. Anyone willing to make a motion that we submit a letter requesting an extension in the deadline?
So moved.
Thank you, Dave. Is there a second?
I would second that.
Thank you, Tom. Any debate or discussion? Anyone have any questions or comments about this? Concerns?
Just, Don, I could distribute the letter that Steve sent to the council after this, so you have that material. And we're talking about just joining on to their letter, not creating a new letter, correct?
Well, I think we're talking about just taking a position to extend the comment deadline, and then we'll evaluate the best way to do that, whether that's joining on or a separate letter.
Okay.
Is that consistent with your motion?
Yes.
Tom?
Correct.
All right, any other comments or questions? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Any abstentions? Okay, great, that's unanimous. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you all.
Any other public comments? I'll close the public comment period. Now, the next item for discussion includes future council meetings. We've already addressed the appropriation allocation issue. Let me read a list of suggested topics that we have for future meetings. Report on the equation of state study, dashboard, the breach monitoring and modeling project, the legislative report that'll be after the session concludes on March 6th, promontory landfill status, agricultural optimization task force, update on federal legislation, a drought update, allocating our appropriations, and then the Pine Valley water project issue. So we have plenty of topics. I don't know if you have others you'd like to add into the queue, or if you'd like to suggest any prioritization of those topics. I would invite anyone, especially members of the advisory council, but anyone, to forward to Laura any suggestions for topics we could include on our agenda. Lynn, you raised your hand.
Yes, I would like, if possible, to put the promontory landfill high on the list. It's likely that there might be a draft permit for the Class 5 going out sometime henceforth. Thank you.
All right, Lynn, and you're interested in someone from the agency or from the landfill?
Agency for sure. I think that's really an important voice to be heard and questioned.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions, recommendations? All right, thank you very much. Any other business to come before the advisory council today? Okay, well, thank you again. Our next meeting is March 9th. I'll note that we typically meet on the second Wednesday of every other month at 10 a.m., but there are a couple of exceptions this year. We'll meet on March 9th. We've deferred our May meeting because it conflicts with the issues forum that Lynn's organization is hosting. We'll meet on July 13th and September 14th. We have moved the November meeting up as a result of discussion at our last meeting because of conflicts with the county officials. And so the November meeting will be November 2 instead of November 9. Any other questions, comments, or business? Thank you for being here, for your participation. It was a good group. We had north of 40 people, and I appreciate that. Laura, thanks for your great work helping put these meetings together. Hearing no other business, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you, Leland. Is there a second?
Second.
Thanks, Dave. Any debate or discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? Any abstentions? We stand adjourned.
Thank you, Don.
The recording of the meeting will be posted to our website.